Have you ever been made to feel small? For 10 years, Elise was the perfect wife to a man who saw her as an accessory. When she finally left, her ex-husband, Gabriel, mocked her, claiming she was dating down. He laughed at the quiet, simple man she'd found. But what Gabriel didn't know was that Elise's new love wasn't just anyone. He was Julian Thorne, the reclusive tech billionaire Gabriel was desperately trying to impress. This is a story about what happens when the world's biggest secret is revealed in the most public way imaginable. It's a story of karma, redemption, and the quiet power of underestimation. The divorce papers were signed in a room that smelled of expensive leather and quiet animosity. Elise Carrington sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her simple navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the diamond-encrusted woman she had been just 6 months ago. Across the mahogany table, Gabriel Devereux, her husband of 10 years, radiated an aura of impatient victory. He wasn't just divorcing her, he was closing a deal, divesting from a non-performing asset. His tailored suit was flawless, his jaw was set, and his eyes, the color of cold steel, held a familiar glint of condescension. "Is that everything?" he asked his lawyer, not Elise. He never spoke directly to her anymore unless it was to issue a command or a criticism. "Just the final signatures, Mr. Devereux." Elise picked up the pen, its weight feeling obscene in her trembling hand. She signed her name, Elise Carrington, reclaiming the identity she had so willingly shed for him. With each stroke, she felt a decade of her life being redacted, a decade of hosting his perfect dinner parties, of smiling vacantly at his tedious business partners, of shelving her art history doctorate to become the flawless, supportive wife of a rising star in the San Francisco venture capital scene. She had been his masterpiece, and now he was putting her in storage. The finality of it didn't bring relief, only a hollow echo of failure. He had left her for a younger woman, an Instagram model named Crystal, whose primary contribution to society was her expertise in flattering photo angles. It was a cliché so painful it felt like a personal insult to Elise's intelligence. A week later, Elise was unpacking the last box in her new life, a small rented cottage in Sausalito, overlooking the bay. The air here was different, thick with salt and the cries of gulls, a world away from the sterile, climate-controlled perfection of their Pacific Heights mansion. The cottage was small, a little damp, but it was hers. Her books, her art prints, her half-finished research papers, the parts of her she had packed away with her maiden name, were slowly filling the space. Her phone buzzed. It was Gabriel. Her stomach tightened into a familiar knot. She had promised herself she would block his number, but the muscle memory of 10 years of availability was a hard thing to sever. "Hello, Gabriel." "Elise," he began, his voice smooth and patronizing. "I trust you're settling into wherever it is you've gone." "I'm fine, Gabriel. What do you want?" "Chloe mentioned you were seeing someone," he said, the amusement in his voice a palpable thing. Chloe was their mutual friend, a notorious gossip who straddled the fence of their broken marriage with acrobatic skill. She said he was an artist or a woodworker, something delightfully rustic. Elise's jaw tightened. She had been on a few dates with Julian. He was a furniture designer she'd met at a small gallery exhibit. He was quiet, thoughtful, with kind eyes and hands that were calloused from actual work, not from gripping a tennis racket at the country club. He listened when she spoke about 14th-century Italian frescoes as if it were the most fascinating subject in the world. He was the antithesis of Gabriel. "My personal life is no longer your concern," she said, her voice colder than she intended. Gabriel chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "Oh, Elise, don't be so defensive. I'm happy for you, truly. It's good for you to find your level. I just worry. You've been accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Don't let this craftsman think he's going to get a piece of the settlement. I'm sure he's impressed by your new bohemian phase, but we both know it's just a phase." Every word was a perfectly calibrated dart aimed at the heart of her insecurities. He was painting her as a charity case, a fallen socialite playing pretend in a shabby little town. The implication was clear. She was damaged goods, and this new man was a downgrade, a consolation prize. "His name is Julian," she said through gritted teeth, "and he's a good man." "I'm sure he is," Gabriel cooed, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. "A simple, good man for my simple former wife. It's perfect, really, poetic. Just try not to bring him to any of our old haunts, will you? It would be embarrassing for everyone." The line went dead. Elise stood in the middle of her small living room, the phone clutched in her hand, shaking with a rage so profound it left her breathless. He had done it again. With a single, effortless conversation, he had made her feel small, foolish, and utterly insignificant. He had taken the first genuine spark of happiness she'd felt in years and doused it in the cold, bitter water of his ego. She looked out the window at the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. For 10 years she had lived in his shadow, her world defined by his ambition. He saw her moving on, not as an act of independence, but as a failure to maintain the standards he had set. Dating down, he'd implied. As if a person's worth could be measured by their net worth or their social standing. That night, Julian came over for dinner. He didn't bring expensive wine, but a beautiful, hand-carved wooden bowl he'd made, filled with lemons from his small garden. He helped her cook, his presence calm and grounding in her tiny kitchen. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answer. As he stood there, his sleeves rolled up, laughing at one of her stories, Elise felt a pang of something fierce and protective. Gabriel saw a simple craftsman. He saw a downgrade. He had no idea who Julian was. No one did. And in that moment, looking at the kind, unassuming man who was patiently sanding the rough edges of her broken heart, Elise held on to his secret like a precious, explosive jewel. Gabriel thought he had won. He thought he had the world figured out. He had no idea the game was about to change. The memory surfaced, unbidden, as Elise chopped vegetables for the salad. It was from 2 years ago at the annual Devereux Capital Winter Gala. She'd been wearing a silver sequined gown that had cost more than her first car, a dress Gabriel had picked out. She felt less like a woman and more like a human disco ball, designed to reflect his success. That night, she'd been cornered by one of Gabriel's oldest and most important clients, a brash real estate tycoon from Texas named Bill Hennessy. He was on his 3rd glass of scotch and had the invasive stare of a man who believed his money bought him the right to be boorish. "So, Ellie," he'd slurred, mispronouncing her name, "Gabe tells me you're into old paintings. Cute. A little hobby to keep you busy while the big boys are out hunting bear, huh?" Elise had forced a tight, polite smile. "It's a bit more than a hobby. My doctoral thesis was on the use of lapis lazuli in Renaissance portraiture. It has fascinating implications for trade routes and—" Hennessy had waved a dismissive, jewel-laden hand. "Whoa there, sweetheart. Don't need a history lesson. Just saying, it's nice that Gabe lets you have your little interests." Later, when she'd recounted the story to Gabriel in the back of their chauffeured car, hoping for a sliver of indignation on her behalf, he had simply sighed. "Elise, Bill Hennessy is responsible for a $30 million fund. Do you understand? His opinion of your thesis is irrelevant. Your job was to smile, look beautiful, and make him feel important. That's it. It's not complicated." "My job," she had whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I thought I was your wife." Gabriel had looked at her then, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights, and his expression was one of genuine bewilderment. "That is the job, darling," he'd said, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. In that moment she realized she wasn't a partner in his life. She was an employee in the startup of Gabriel Devereux, and her role was Chief Aesthetics Officer. Her own ambitions, her intellect, her passions, they were all relegated to the category of cute little interests, permissible only as long as they didn't interfere with her primary duties. The sting of that memory was still sharp, a ghost that haunted the corners of her newfound freedom. Now, standing in her own kitchen, the scent of garlic and rosemary filling the air, She watched Julian carefully arrange slices of heirloom tomato on a platter. He worked with a quiet, deliberate focus, the same focus he applied to his furniture, his hands moving with a grace that belied their strength. "Something on your mind?" he asked, not looking up. He had an uncanny ability to read her moods, to sense the subtle shifts in her energy. She hesitated, then decided on the truth. Gabriel's cruelty festered in silence. "I spoke to my ex-husband today." Julian's hands stilled. He looked up, his warm hazel eyes full of concern. He didn't press, just waited. "He knows I'm seeing someone," she continued, her voice low. "He made it clear he disapproves. He thinks I'm making a mistake, that I'm lowering my standards." She couldn't bring herself to repeat the phrase, dating down. It felt too humiliating to say out loud. Julian wiped his hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "And what do you think?" The question was so simple, yet so profound. Gabriel had never asked for her opinion. He had only ever given her his. "I think he's a narcissist whose ego is so fragile he can only feel big by making others feel small," she said, the words tumbling out with a surprising ferocity. "I think he measures a person's worth by the size of their bank account and the brand of their watch, and I think he's incapable of understanding what a good man actually is." A slow smile spread across Julian's face. "Well, I can't argue with that assessment." He stepped closer, gently taking the knife from her hand and placing it on the cutting board. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a comfort, a warm, solid presence in the small kitchen. "Elise, what Gabriel Devereux thinks of me or of you means less than nothing. His opinion is a currency that has no value in this house." His words were a balm. He wasn't angry or defensive or insecure. He was simply solid, grounded. He knew his own worth, and it had nothing to do with external validation. He was a man who found joy in the grain of a piece of oak, in the perfect angle of a dovetail joint, in the way the evening light hit the water. His world was rich with things Gabriel would never even notice, let alone appreciate. "He called you a craftsman," she admitted quietly. Julian's smile widened. "It's the highest compliment I can imagine. It means I create things of substance." "What does he create? Unhappy employees and complicated spreadsheets?" She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the room. They ate dinner on the small porch, the cool night air a welcome relief. They talked for hours about her research, about a new type of wood he was experimenting with, about old movies and terrible music from their teenage years. With Julian, conversation was an easy, flowing river. With Gabriel, it had been a performance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of his disapproval. Later, as he was leaving, he paused at the door. "For the record," he said, his expression serious now, "I know I'm not what you're used to. This life, my life, is quiet. There aren't any galas or benefits. I clean my own gutters. I don't own a tuxedo." "Good," she said, her voice soft. "I hate tuxedos, and I'm deathly afraid of gutters." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers brushing against her skin. The contact was electric, a simple, honest touch that conveyed more than 1,000 of Gabriel's performative kisses. "You're not lowering your standards, Elise," he said, his eyes searching hers. "You're changing them." He left her standing in the doorway, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. He was right. Her standards had been set by a man who valued assets, not people. She was through with living in a gilded cage. For the first time she was setting the standards herself, and they had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with kindness, respect, and the quiet, profound beauty of a hand-carved bowl filled with lemons. Gabriel Devereux lived his life like a shark in constant forward motion, believing that to stop moving was to die. His world was one of metrics, of quarterly reports, of ruthless predatory growth. And the biggest whale in the entire ocean, The one he had been hunting for the better part of a year was Julian Thorne. Thorne was a legend in Silicon Valley, a figure spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. He had founded Ether, a data synthesis company, in his garage 15 years ago. Now it was a global behemoth, the invisible architecture behind half the digital world. But Thorne himself was an enigma. He was notoriously private, a recluse who hadn't given an interview in a decade. He was a ghost in the machine he had built, a man who controlled immense power but seemed to have no interest in the ostentatious displays of it that were so common in their world. He didn't own a sports team, he wasn't trying to colonize Mars, and his name was never in the gossip columns. For a man like Gabriel, who equated success with visibility, Thorne's quiet omnipotence was both infuriating and endlessly fascinating. Getting a meeting with him was harder than getting an audience with the Pope. But Gabriel was close. He had spent months cultivating a relationship with Ether's COO, a man named Marcus Vance, and he had finally secured what he was after. A 30-minute pitch meeting. Not with some underling, but with Thorne himself. This meeting was Gabriel's Everest. Ether was looking to acquire a portfolio of smaller, innovative AI companies, and Devereaux Capital had curated the perfect selection. Landing this deal wouldn't just be a win, it would be a coronation. It would catapult him into the stratosphere, placing him in the rarefied air of the true kingmakers. His entire life was now oriented around this single event. He had his team working around the clock, wargaming every possible question, refining every slide of the presentation until it was a masterpiece of corporate rhetoric. He had a new suit tailored, a Xenia masterpiece of understated power. He even rehearsed his handshake in the mirror. In the midst of this all-consuming obsession, his thoughts of Elise were fleeting and dismissive. He pictured her in her little seaside shack, playing house with her carpenter boyfriend. The image was pathetic, but it served a useful purpose. It reinforced his own narrative of success. He was ascending, moving toward the sun, while she was sinking into a cozy, irrelevant mediocrity. Her choice to leave him was, in his mind, the gravest miscalculation of her life. She had traded a ringside seat at the championship fight for a picnic blanket in the park. One afternoon, his second-in-command, a sharp, hungry young analyst named Ben, came into his office looking pale. "Sir, we have a problem with the Lumina tech projection." Gabriel looked up from his notes, annoyed at the interruption. "What problem?" "Their burn rate is higher than they reported, significantly. If we include them in the portfolio, it could look like we're hiding a vulnerability." Gabriel's jaw clenched. Lumina was a key piece of the package. Then fix the numbers, recontextualize the data, frame it as aggressive investment in R&D, not a cash hemorrhage. "I tried that, sir," Ben said, sweating slightly. "But it's a lie. And the word is, Thorne has an almost supernatural ability to sniff out bullshit. He'll see right through it." Gabriel stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, which offered a panoramic view of the city and the bay beyond. He could almost see Sausalito from here, a quaint little smudge on the horizon. "Everyone in this business is lying, Ben," Gabriel said, his back to the young analyst. "The trick isn't to tell the truth, it's to tell the most convincing lie. Thorne didn't get where he is by being a Boy Scout. He got there by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. He'll respect the audacity. What he won't respect is weakness. Pulling Lumina now would be an admission of weakness, so you're not going to pull it. You're going to go back to your desk, and you're going to make that data sing, you understand?" "Yes, sir," Ben mumbled and retreated from the office. Gabriel remained at the window, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The kid was right. It was a risk. But Gabriel had built his career on calculated risks. He saw business as a form of warfare, and in war there were acceptable losses. The truth was often one of them. He thought of Elise again, of her quiet, infuriating integrity. She was the kind of person who would have agonized over a decision like this, who would have talked about moral hazards and ethical obligations. It was one of the things that had made her so ill-suited for his world. She operated on a different frequency, one that didn't understand the brutal calculus of ambition. His phone chimed. It was a calendar alert. Crystal, dinner at Perbacco. He sighed. Crystal was another kind of asset. Beautiful, uncomplicated, and utterly unconcerned with things like corporate ethics. She was the perfect accessory for the man he was becoming. But lately, he found her incessant chatter about social media influencers and brand collaborations to be more draining than relaxing. She was a beautiful, empty room, and sometimes the echo was deafening. He shook the thought away. This was what he wanted. The power, the prestige, the beautiful woman, the view from the top. He was on the verge of the biggest victory of his life. Everything was going according to plan. His ascent was inevitable. He stared out at the bay, at the distant hazy shore where Elise was living her small, insignificant life, and he felt a surge of pity for her. She would never understand the thrill of the climb, the savage beauty of the view from the summit. Chloe Dubois considered herself a master of social navigation. She moved through the elite circles of San Francisco like a diplomat in a war zone, maintaining alliances on all sides, her loyalty a famously flexible commodity. She genuinely liked both Gabriel and Elise, and their divorce had presented her with her most significant diplomatic challenge to date. She met Gabriel for cocktails at the Battery and Elise for tea in Sausalito, carefully curating the information she shared with each, positioning herself as the indispensable confidant. She found Elise in the small garden behind her cottage, tending to a pot of lavender. Elise looked different. Her face, free from the mask of meticulously applied makeup she used to wear, had a new softness. She wore a simple linen dress, and her feet were bare. She looked younger, calmer. She looked happy, and for some reason this unsettled Chloe. "You look wonderful, darling," Chloe said, air-kissing both of Elise's cheeks. "This sea air agrees with you. It's all very wholesome." Elise smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "It's quiet. I like the quiet." Chloe settled into a wicker chair, accepting a glass of iced tea. "Well, the city is anything but. Everyone is buzzing about Gabriel's big meeting. You know, with Julian Thorne, the ether phantom. If Gabe pulls this off, he'll basically be a god." Elise's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, continuing to prune a dead leaf from a plant. "I hope it goes well for him." Her placid response was not what Chloe had expected. She'd anticipated some lingering bitterness, a touch of envy, perhaps. This serene indifference was disarming. "You've heard from him, I assume?" Chloe probed, stirring her tea. "We spoke last week," Elise said evenly. "And?" Elise finally looked at her, her eyes clear and direct. "And he was the same Gabriel he's always been." Chloe took that as her cue. Time to pivot. "Well, enough about him. I want to hear about your new man, the artist." "He's a furniture designer," Elise corrected gently. "His name is Julian." "Julian," Chloe repeated, tasting the name. It was a solid, classic name, unpretentious. "And it's serious?" "It's easy," Elise said after a moment's thought. "He's kind and he makes me laugh. He doesn't seem to want anything from me other than my company." Chloe leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Darling, be careful. I know you're on the rebound, and a handsome, rustic type can be very appealing. A fantasy. But this is the real world. You're used to a certain level of security, of polish. Does this Julian, does he understand your background, where you're coming from?" The subtext was clear. Is he good enough for you? Can he provide for you? It was the same line of thinking as Gabriel's, just wrapped in a velvet glove of feigned concern. "He understands who I am now," Elise replied, her tone still gentle, but with an underlying firmness that was new. "And frankly, I think my background is something I'm trying to move on from. The security, the polish. It was all just a beautiful cage, Chloe." Chloe sat back, momentarily silenced. The old Elise would have been flustered by such a direct line of questioning. She would have deferred or deflected. This new Elise was unnervingly self-possessed. "I'm just worried about you," Chloe insisted, trying a different tack. "Gabriel is, well, he's powerful, and he's vindictive. He's telling people that you're having some sort of breakdown, that you've run off with a penniless nobody to spite him. You need to be aware of the narrative he's creating." A flash of anger the first Elise had shown sparked in her eyes. "Let him create whatever narrative he wants. It's fiction. I'm done living my life according to his script." "But appearances matter, darling, you know that. What will people think?" "I'm starting to realize that the people whose opinions I value don't care about appearances," Elise said. "And the people who care about appearances, their opinions don't matter." She stood up and walked over to a small, beautifully crafted wooden bench that sat near the edge of the garden, overlooking the water. "Julian made this for me." Chloe looked at the bench. It was exquisite. The lines were clean and elegant, the wood a warm, rich walnut. It was a piece of functional art, simple, sturdy, and beautiful. It was everything their old life hadn't been. "It's lovely," Chloe admitted. "He's bringing his truck over later," Elise said, a playful smile on her lips. "We're going to a salvage yard in Richmond to look for old reclaimed timber. He gets excited about things like that. The history in the wood, he says." She looked at Chloe, her expression open and honest. "Last month, I spent an entire afternoon helping him sand a tabletop. My hands were covered in sawdust, my back ached, and I was happier than I ever was at any of those charity galas. Does that sound like a breakdown to you?" Chloe had no answer. She looked at her friend, truly looked at her, and saw a woman who was not breaking down but breaking free. The world Chloe and Gabriel inhabited, a world of status and strategy, of narratives and appearances, seemed suddenly flimsy and unreal compared to the solid, tangible reality of this garden, this bench, this quiet, hard-won happiness. She left Sausalito that afternoon feeling deeply unsettled. She had come to offer warnings, to gently guide Elise back toward the world she understood. Instead, she felt as if she were the one who had been warned. Elise wasn't dating down. She was climbing a different mountain altogether, one whose summit couldn't be seen from Gabriel's high-rise office. And Chloe had a sudden, chilling premonition that Gabriel, in his relentless ascent, was about to suffer a very, very long fall. The annual Bay Area Innovators Gala was the social and professional apex of the year. It was a glittering confluence of tech money, political power, and old-world philanthropy held at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. For Gabriel Devereux, it was the perfect stage. His meeting with Julian Thorne was in 2 days, and this was his opportunity to project an aura of calm, inevitable success. He was the man of the hour, and he wanted everyone to know it. He arrived with Crystal on his arm. She was breathtaking in a crimson gown that seemed to be held in place by sheer force of will, her every movement calculated for maximum photographic impact. Gabriel, in a classic Tom Ford tuxedo, felt a surge of pride. They were the ultimate power couple, a portrait of modern success. He worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, clapping backs, his laughter perfectly modulated, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, networking. He spotted Chloe holding court near the bar and made his way over. "Gabriel, darling," she trilled, offering him a cheek. "You look like you've already closed the deal." "Confidence is half the battle, Chloe," he said with a wolfish grin. "Have you seen who's on the host committee this year?" He gestured vaguely at the large donor wall. Chloe's eyes followed his gesture, and her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I did notice. Quite the surprise." Gabriel hadn't actually looked, too busy with his own performance. He glanced at the wall now, his eyes scanning the list of platinum-level sponsors. And then he saw it. Near the bottom of the list, in small, discreet lettering, "Hosted in partnership with the Thorne Foundation." His heart gave a sharp, sudden jolt. Julian Thorne. Here? The man was famously allergic to public events. It had to be a token sponsorship. He wouldn't actually show up. The idea was absurd. Still, a nervous energy began to thrum beneath his skin. He excused himself, leaving Crystal to pout and take selfies with a rival model. He needed to be sharp, focused. The possibility, however remote, that Thorne was in the building changed the entire dynamic of the evening. This was no longer just a party, it was a hunting ground. He was making his way through the throng in the main atrium, his eyes scanning every face when he saw her. Elise. She was standing near a towering Richard Serra sculpture, a monolith of rusting steel. She looked luminous. She wore a simple, elegant dress of deep emerald green that clung to her frame. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and her only jewelry was a pair of delicate, understated earrings. She wasn't trying to command attention, yet she was the most captivating woman in the room. She was talking to an older couple, her expression animated, her hands gesturing as she lightly explained some nuance of the artwork beside her. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Gabriel. Annoyance, first and foremost. What was she doing here? This was his world, his territory. Then a smug pity. She was probably here with some gallery owner, a +1, clinging to the fringes of the life she'd thrown away. He watched as the couple she was speaking with moved on, leaving her alone for a moment. This was his chance. He began to walk toward her, a perfectly crafted line of condescending pity forming on his lips. "Elise, I'm surprised to see you here. It must be a little overwhelming." Yes, that was it. Perfect. He was about 10 feet away when a man stepped out from behind the sculpture to join her. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit with no tie, a subtle act of rebellion in this sea of formal wear. He had a calm, unassuming presence, yet there was an unmistakable aura of authority about him. He smiled at Elise, a private, intimate smile, and handed her a glass of champagne. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and her answering smile was one of pure, unadulterated happiness. Gabriel stopped dead. His brain stuttered, struggling to process the scene. He knew the man's face. He had spent the last 6 months staring at it, memorizing it from the rare, grainy photos that existed online. It was a face he saw in his dreams, the face of his ambition, his obsession, his Everest. It was Julian Thorne. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ambient chatter of the gala faded into a dull roar. Gabriel stared, his mind refusing to connect the dots. Julian Thorne with Elise. His simple former wife and her craftsman, the furniture designer. It was impossible. It was a hallucination, but it wasn't. Thorne leaned in and murmured something in Elise's ear. She laughed, a sound that was both familiar and alien to Gabriel, and she put her hand on Thorne's arm. It was a gesture of easy intimacy, of possession. They looked like a couple. They looked like they belonged together. Gabriel felt the blood drain from his face. Every smug assumption, every cruel joke, every patronizing thought he'd ever had about Elise's new life came crashing down on him with the force of an avalanche. He had mocked her for dating down. He had pitied her for finding a simple man. That simple man, that craftsman, was the ghost king of Silicon Valley. The man Gabriel had been groveling and strategizing for months to get 30 minutes with was casually sharing champagne with the woman Gabriel had discarded. The power dynamic of his entire universe had just been inverted. He was no longer the shark. He was the plankton. Suddenly, Elise's eyes lifted and met his from across the atrium. Her smile didn't falter, but a new awareness entered her gaze. There was no triumph in her expression. No, "I told you so." There was just a quiet, sad recognition. She knew. She had known all along. Then Julian Thorne followed her gaze. His eyes, calm and intelligent, settled on Gabriel. He didn't know Gabriel personally, but he would know his face from the pitch deck his COO had forwarded him. Thorne's expression was unreadable, but Gabriel felt himself pinned by that placid, analytical stare. In that moment, he felt utterly, irrevocably exposed. Every lie, every shortcut, every ounce of his slick, manufactured confidence was stripped away, leaving him naked and shivering in his $1,000 tuxedo. He had walked over to pity his ex-wife. Now he was the most pathetic man in the room. Gabriel didn't remember leaving the gala. He had a vague, fragmented memory of mumbling an excuse to a bewildered Crystal, of stumbling through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cool night air hit him like a physical blow, but it did nothing to clear the roaring in his head. He sat in the back of his car, the city lights blurring into meaningless streaks of neon. The driver, accustomed to Gabriel's moods, remained silent. All Gabriel could see was the image of Elise and Julian Thorne burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The way she'd looked at him, the easy intimacy, her quiet, devastating knowledge of the secret she'd been keeping. Humiliation was a foreign emotion to Gabriel Devereux. He'd experienced anger, frustration, impatience, but this was different. This was a bottomless, gut-wrenching shame that seemed to dissolve the very foundations of his identity. He hadn't just been wrong, he'd been a fool. A pompous, arrogant, catastrophically blind fool. His phone buzzed. It was Crystal. "Where did you go?" "Rude." He ignored it. Another buzz. "Chloe. Call me. Now." He ignored that one too. He got back to his sterile, minimalist mansion and went straight to the bar, pouring himself a large scotch. He downed it in 2 swallows, the burn doing nothing to quell the inferno in his gut. His mind, usually a sharp, orderly machine, was a chaotic storm of recriminations, every condescending word he'd said to Elise replayed in a torturous loop. "It's good for you to find your level. Don't let this craftsman think he's going to get a piece of the settlement. It would be embarrassing for everyone." Embarrassing, the word was a bitter mockery now. He had assumed she was weak, lost, pitiable. He had defined her entire existence as a reaction to his, but he was the one who had been living in the dark. She hadn't been dating down. She had been operating on a level so far above his own that he hadn't even been able to perceive it. While he was playing checkers, she had been playing chess. No, that wasn't right. She hadn't been playing a game at all. She had just been living her life, quietly, authentically, and had stumbled into a position of more power than he could ever dream of. His phone rang. It was Elise. His first instinct was to ignore it, but a desperate, morbid curiosity compelled him to answer. He had to hear her voice. He had to know. "Hello?" he said, his own voice sounding rough and unfamiliar. "Gabriel, are you okay?" Her tone was calm, devoid of the gloating triumph he had expected. It was worse. It was pity. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, the words raw and accusatory. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Tell you what exactly? That I was happy? I tried. You weren't interested. Or did you want me to tell you who I was dating so you could try to leverage it for your own gain?" The accusation hit its mark because he knew with a sickening certainty that it was true. If he had known, he would have used it. He would have tried to get to Thorne through her, cheapening her relationship and turning it into another one of his assets. So this was all some kind of revenge plot, he sneered, falling back on his old familiar cruelty. "You set me up?" "You give me far too much credit," she said, and for the first time he heard a note of weariness in her voice, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent a decade managing his ego. "I met a man, a kind, decent man who happens to be a furniture designer. We connected. I fell in love with him. That's the entire story. His other life, the one the world knows about, has nothing to do with us. I kept it private because it was private. It was ours. It had nothing to do with you." "Nothing to do with me?" He laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Elise, I have a meeting with him in 2 days, a meeting I've spent a year of my life working for. This changes everything." "It changes nothing about the merits of your business proposal, does it?" she asked, her voice cool and logical. "Unless, of course, the merits weren't as strong as you thought they were." And there it was, the quiet, surgical incision that laid him bare. She knew about his bluster, his reliance on charm and aggression to cover for the flaws in his arguments. "I need you to talk to him," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Smooth this over. Explain." "Explain what?" "That his girlfriend's ex-husband is a condescending bully who has spent the last 6 months insulting him without even knowing who he was. I think he probably got that impression all by himself tonight," she said. "Gabriel, this is your mess. I'm not cleaning it up for you, not anymore." The line went dead. He was alone in the vast empty house that had once been the symbol of his success. It now felt like a mausoleum. He had spent his entire life building an empire of appearances, and with a single glance across a crowded room, she had demolished it. He thought of Julian Thorne, not the myth, but the man he'd seen tonight. The quiet confidence, the complete lack of pretense, the genuine affection in his eyes when he looked at Elise. Thorne hadn't needed a tuxedo or a flashy watch to command the room. He had a centered, grounded power that Gabriel, with all his bluster, had never come close to achieving. Gabriel looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw a man in a perfect suit with a perfect life who had just lost everything that mattered. And the most terrifying part was, he was only just beginning to understand what that was. The meeting was in 2 days. It was no longer a pitch. It was a reckoning. The Ether headquarters did not look like the command center of a global tech empire. Tucked away in a quiet wooded campus in Cupertino, it resembled a minimalist art retreat. There was no towering glass monolith, no ostentatious corporate logo. The buildings were low-slung, made of natural wood and stone, designed to blend into the landscape. It was a place of infuriatingly quiet power. Gabriel Devereaux walked through the lobby, his polished leather shoes echoing on the slate floor. He felt as if he were walking to his own execution. He had barely slept in 2 days, his mind replaying the gala on a relentless loop. He had tried to prepare, to re-strategize, but his usual confidence had been replaced by a gnawing, hollow dread. He was led not to a grand boardroom, but to a small, simple meeting room with a single window overlooking a serene Japanese garden. There was a long, unadorned table made of a single piece of light-colored wood. It was beautiful. Gabriel hated it instantly. Julian Thorne was already there, sitting at the head of the table, nursing a ceramic mug of tea. He wore a simple grey Henley and dark jeans. He looked more like a philosophy professor than a man worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Marcus Vance, the COO, stood beside him, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Mr. Devereaux," Julian said, his voice calm and even. He did not stand up. "Please have a seat." Gabriel sat, placing his leather-bound presentation on the table. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the sound of a small fountain trickling in the garden outside. "I've reviewed the portfolio you've prepared," Julian began, his eyes fixed on Gabriel. They were intelligent, analytical eyes, and Gabriel felt like a specimen under a microscope. "It's ambitious." Gabriel cleared his throat, launching into the speech he had rehearsed 1,000 times. "We believe it represents a unique synergistic opportunity, a curated ecosystem of next-generation AI that will integrate seamlessly into the Ether platform, creating exponential value and—" Julian held up a hand, a simple, quiet gesture that immediately silenced him. "Let's talk about Lumina Tech," Julian said, his tone conversational. "Your projections for their Q4 growth are optimistic, especially given their current cash burn rate, which, according to our analysis, is 37% higher than what's stated in your prospectus." Gabriel's blood ran cold. It was the exact vulnerability Ben had warned him about. The lie. "We see that as an aggressive but necessary investment in their core R&D, Gabriel said, his voice sounding slick and false even to his own ears. "It's a long-term play, positioning them for market dominance in—" "It's a lie, Mr. Devereaux," Julian said, not with anger but with a quiet, devastating finality. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was Ether's internal analysis of Lumina, a brutal, forensic dismantling of their finances. It's a lie designed to inflate the value of a failing company to make your portfolio look more attractive. It's a house of cards, and you assumed I wouldn't have the sense to look in the basement." Gabriel stared at the paper, his face burning. He had no response. He had been so certain he could bluff his way through that Thorne would respect the audacity. But he had fundamentally misjudged the man. Julian Thorne didn't play games of audacity. He played for keeps, with facts. "The rest of the portfolio is similarly flawed," Julian continued, leaning back in his chair. "You've prioritized flash over substance, sizzle over steak. You're not selling a future, you're selling a narrative. Ether is in the business of reality, Mr. Devereaux. We don't buy narratives." Each word was a nail in the coffin of Gabriel's career. He had been so thoroughly, so effortlessly dismantled. This wasn't just a rejection, it was an annihilation. Julian took a slow sip of his tea. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Gabriel felt the need to say something, anything, to salvage a shred of dignity. "Look," he began, his voice strained, "about the other night, about Elise." Julian's eyes hardened, just slightly. "This meeting is about your professional judgment, Mr. Devereaux, which I have found to be deeply, fundamentally wanting. We don't need to bring personal matters into it." He said it as if there were no connection, as if the personal and professional were two entirely separate realms. But Gabriel knew better. This was the final, crushing blow. By refusing to even acknowledge the personal connection, Julian was communicating something far more profound, that Gabriel Devereaux, the man, was just as bankrupt as his business proposal. He wasn't even worth the anger. "I think we're done here," Julian said, placing his mug down with a soft click. He stood up. "Marcus will see you out." He didn't offer a handshake. He simply turned and walked toward the door leading to the garden, leaving Gabriel sitting at the table, his useless, expensive presentation in front of him. As Gabriel stood up, his legs feeling weak, Marcus Vance gave him a look of something between pity and disgust. "He knew," Marcus whispered, once Thorne was out of earshot. "He knew about your connection to Elise before the gala. He knew who you were." The words hit Gabriel with the force of a physical blow. Julian had known. He had known. And he had let Gabriel walk into that gala, preening and posturing, a peacock strutting towards a cliff. He had let him expose himself for exactly what he was. The entire thing hadn't been a test of his business acumen. It had been a character test. And Gabriel had failed it before he even walked in the door. He had failed it months ago with every condescending word he'd ever spoken to the woman Julian Thorne loved. Walking out of the Ether campus, back into the bright, indifferent California sunlight, Gabriel felt a hollowness he had never known. He had lost the deal of a lifetime. But that wasn't it. He had been weighed, measured, and found wanting by the two people whose judgment, he was horrified to realize, now mattered to him most. The titan of his industry, and the woman he had so carelessly thrown away. The days that followed were a blur of managed decline. The news of his failure, which should have remained a private humiliation, somehow leaked. The whispers started almost immediately. Devereaux had overplayed his hand. He had misread the room. In the piranha tank of venture capital, the scent of blood was in the water. A key investor pulled their funding. Two of his rising stars quit, poached by a rival firm. The empire he had built with such ruthless efficiency began to crumble, its foundations revealed to be nothing more than sand. Crystal left him. Her departure was as shallow as her arrival, a brief, tearless conversation in which she explained that she needed to be with someone who was on an upward trajectory. He didn't have the energy to argue. He simply watched her pack her designer suitcases, a ghost in his own home. He was adrift, stripped of the trappings that had defined him. The deal, the woman, the status. He drank. He sat for hours in the cavernous, silent mansion, staring at the art he had bought but never truly seen, the expensive furniture that offered no comfort. He was surrounded by the spoils of a victory that now felt utterly hollow. One afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he got in his car and drove. He didn't head for the city or the coast. He drove inland, east, toward the sun-baked, dusty towns of the Central Valley. He drove until the landscape became flat and agricultural, the air thick with the smell of earth and fertilizer. He ended up in Stockton, the city he had clawed his way out of 30 years ago. He parked his gleaming black Mercedes on a cracked sun-bleached street in front of a small, dilapidated house with a chain-link fence. His childhood home. He got out of the car, his expensive suit feeling like a costume. The house was smaller than he remembered, the paint peeling, the lawn a patch of brown weeds. He could see the window of his old bedroom, the room where he had lain awake at night, dreaming of escape. He had dreamed of a life of power, of importance, of becoming a man so successful that no one could ever touch him, a man so far removed from this world of rust and poverty that it might as well have been on another planet. He had achieved it all. He had become that man, and that man was a fraud. Leaning against his car, the heat shimmering off the asphalt, the truth finally broke through the wall of his ego. His ambition hadn't been a noble pursuit of excellence. It had been a panicked flight from the terrified boy who had grown up in this house. His obsession with status, his need to dominate, his cruelty toward Elise, it was all rooted in a deep, desperate fear of being found out, of being revealed as that same scared, insignificant kid from Stockton. He had treated Elise the way he had because she represented a different kind of value, one he couldn't quantify or control. Her love for art, her quiet intelligence, her integrity. These things were a threat to his carefully constructed world of metrics and transactions. He couldn't own them, so he had to diminish them. He had to make her feel small, so that his own fragile, terrified ego could feel big. And then there was Julian Thorne. Thorne was everything Gabriel had pretended to be, but for real. He had the power, the success, the brilliance. But he wore it like a comfortable coat, not a suit of armor. He wasn't running from anything. He was a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who found value in a well-made piece of wood, who loved Elise not because she was an asset, but because of who she was. Julian Thorne, the billionaire, was a craftsman, and Gabriel Devereux, the master of the universe, had built nothing of substance his entire life. A car rattled down the street, and a woman on the porch of the house next door eyed him with suspicion. He was an alien here, a tourist in his own past. He got back in the car and started the long drive back to San Francisco. The self-pity and rage had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear, empty space. For the first time he saw himself without the flattering filters of wealth and success. He saw a man who had gained the world and lost his soul. He had betrayed his wife, his partners, and ultimately himself. The mirror had cracked, and the reflection staring back was of a man he didn't recognize and didn't want to be. The climb to the top had been exhilarating, but the fall was where the real reckoning began. It was no longer about winning or losing. It was about finding a way to live with the man in the shattered glass. A year passed. The seasons in the Bay Area shifted with subtle grace, the fog thickening and receding, the hills turning from green to gold and back again. Elise Carrington stood in the center of a brightly lit, airy space in downtown Sausalito. The sign on the door, in elegant, understated lettering, read Carrington Gallery. It was her own. After the gala, Julian had offered to fund any project she could dream of, but she had politely refused. Instead, she had taken a portion of her divorce settlement, the money she had once seen as a symbol of her failure, and invested it in herself. She secured a small business loan. Julian's contribution was the gallery's front desk and the elegant display benches, all of which he had designed and built himself. His belief in her was a silent, sturdy presence, far more valuable than his money. The gallery was a success. Elise had a keen eye and a passion that was infectious. She championed emerging local artists, her academic background giving her a unique credibility. She was no longer Mrs. Gabriel Devereux, the elegant hostess. She was Elise Carrington, a respected figure in the art community, a woman who had built something real and beautiful on her own terms. Her relationship with Julian had deepened, settling into a comfortable, loving rhythm. Their life was quiet, private, a world away from the glare of his public persona. They spent their weekends hiking on Mount Tamalpais, exploring flea markets for hidden treasures, and cooking together in her small cottage. He was her partner, her friend, her greatest champion. His wealth was just a fact, like his eye color or his height. It was the least interesting thing about him. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was closing the gallery for the day when the bell on the door chimed. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. As he stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was Gabriel. He looked profoundly different. The razor-sharp, predatory energy was gone. He was thinner, and there were lines of exhaustion around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple pair of trousers and a worn tweed jacket. He looked like a man who had been humbled by a long, difficult journey. "Gabriel," she said, her voice steady. She felt no fear, no anger, only a distant, quiet surprise. "Hello, Elise," he said. His voice was softer, stripped of its old arrogance. This is a beautiful place. You've done well." "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. He looked around the gallery, his eyes taking in the paintings, the sculptures, his gaze lingering on the beautiful wooden benches. "I sold the firm," he said suddenly. "What was left of it, I took a pretty big loss." He said it not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact. "I'm moving, leaving the city." "Oh," she said, "where are you going?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere quiet. I have a sister in Oregon I haven't spoken to in 15 years. Maybe I'll start there." He looked at her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she saw a genuine, unvarnished vulnerability in his eyes. "Elise, I didn't come here to ask for anything. I just came to say that I was wrong, about everything, about you, about what matters, about myself." He took a breath, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "I was a coward. I was so terrified of being the poor kid from Stockton that I built this character. And I destroyed everything good in my life to protect him. I belittled your intelligence because I was intimidated by it. I dismissed your passion because I didn't have any of my own. I was a hollow man, and I tried to make you hollow too. I am so profoundly sorry for all of it." The apology was not the one she had once craved, the one she had replayed in her mind in the lonely months after the divorce. This was better, because it was real. It wasn't designed to win her back or to absolve his guilt. It was a simple, painful confession. "Thank you, Gabriel," she said, and she meant it. "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you find what you're looking for." He nodded, a flicker of a sad smile on his face. "I think for the first time, I'm not looking for anything. I'm just trying to see what's already there." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "He's a good man, Elise. Julian, you were right." "Yes," she said softly, "he is." He left, the bell chiming his exit. Elise stood alone in her gallery, the afternoon light streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She felt a sense of closure so complete it was like a quiet, cleansing rain. His apology hadn't been for her, not really. It had been for him. And her forgiveness, she realized, had happened long before he'd walked through that door. It had happened the moment she had decided to value herself. She locked the door and walked out into the cool Sausalito air, heading for home, where she knew a kind, decent man was waiting for her, a man who had seen her clearly from the very beginning. She had not dated down or up. She had simply moved on, to a place where a person's worth wasn't a measurement, but a truth, as solid and as beautiful as a hand-carved bench in a quiet garden overlooking the sea. Gabriel's downfall wasn't just about losing a deal, it was about the collapse of a life built on a faulty foundation, and Elise's victory wasn't about marrying a billionaire, it was about her quiet, powerful decision to define her own worth. Their story is a powerful reminder that the best revenge is not a loud, dramatic explosion, but the undeniable success of a life well lived on your own terms. What did you think of Gabriel's final apology? Was his redemption earned? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Elise's journey from a gilded cage to a life of authentic happiness, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And for more emotional stories about the complexities of life, love, and karma, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for watching.